There's so much to talk about when it comes to Cubism and abstraction. I want to start with Reedy, though, because she does something very wonderful, which she thinks deeply about how it feels like, what it feels like to deal with Cubism. She writes, "The thing is, no matter how disorderly Cubism seems," and that's an excellent word, "it has been thoroughly planned and purposely put together a certain way." Indeed, let's stop and reflect on that. Here's one of Picasso's brilliant synthetic cubist drawing plus collages. It's actually titled Majoli, right? So the portrait Majoli in the book is one of many iterations of this theme. So here you see the song here on the green book. And it does seem all helter-skelter and everything sort of half done and erasing and falling off. And yet, of course, there is, as Reedy says, so much thought and planning into, the different textures of the charcoal tool used to make these dots, this speckling, versus to make these facet-like lines, versus to make the shading, and then the kind of lettering. All of this is enormously thoughtful. So that's a very helpful insight. And then Reedy goes on and says the fact that the artist who created the art piece had specific intentions and wanted to make a certain point scares me, as I may not be able to understand what they were trying to say. Hooray for Reedy for saying such an essential truth that everyone feels intimidated by Cubism, that it's an intimidating mode of art, and we just feel sort of paralyzed, like, am I going to get this right? So I would say that one thing that's helpful is there may not be just a certain point, an A, as if there's only one point. There may actually be many ideas in play that you are invited to play with your mind. As Reedy says, there's maybe sort of kind of a figure in the sense that you can sort of make out the way these shapes and forms kind of have a vaguely pyramidal structure, but, maybe you can make out bits and pieces here, but it's nothing like we learned to think about portraiture when we looked at Rembrandt at the beginning of the semester, and we had this pyramid shape because we're seeing a body that's coherent, and we enjoy the illusion of the satin, the light on the fur, the light on the ruff, the light on flesh. We feel as if everything is precisely depicted in terms of the actual visual and textural understanding of the world. So I think one of the reasons it's intimidating is exactly what Reedy says. What is Picasso trying to say here? And I want to suggest that it might be more productive to ask, what is Picasso doing here? So what he's doing is calling up the tradition of the still life or the portrait, these old established traditions. He's calling them up with certain artistic moves, like laying out the shape that would a rectangle like a table. He's calling up the idea of the sketch, but then he's also undoing that tradition, because this doesn't really form into a table. And this does evoke a bottle, and it has the letters Bass on it, and yet it's flat. Things are stacked. He's creating a sense that we have space as in overlapping, in front of, behind, and yet that space seems to be jumbled and unreliable. So what he's doing is he's setting you up as a viewer to have to investigate, to wonder, and to work a little bit, to have an experience, to have it not all be available to you all at once, the way the portrait of Nicholas von Rotz was. Even though there's more to see in the portrait as you look more closely. Picasso, oops, wrong one. Where'd you go, Majali? Picasso is making you puzzle it out. He's problematizing the act of representation. With Nicholas von Rutz, we feel as if representation is transparent, that all we have to do is look, that we're seeing clearly through a transparent window onto the actual world. We don't have that at all with Look up the dictionary definition of problematize. I want you to know this word. It's important in terms of critical thinking and scholarly inquiry because it's a kind of a starting point for deep investigation. To problematize is to make into or regard as a problem requiring a solution, which means you're taking something that you maybe have always assumed you know, or never noticed, or never thought about, and you're starting to treat it as if it were a problem to figure it out. You're starting to probe it as if it were a puzzle, and you're going to lay out the parts. So the example they give here is he problematized the concept of history, which is what a historian might do. They might think, what do we mean when we say we're doing history? How do we know what that is? And I think Picasso is problematizing the whole project of representing the world. But he's doing it in a very playful way. And I can understand why it's intimidating that, how am I going to understand this? What's his point? And to think about it as problematizing, the very word problematizing is so academic, right? It can be intimidating. But the idea is you're seeing something as if you maybe don't understand it and you need to explore it. And so one of the ways that Picasso is problematizing is he's just playing, and he's inviting you to allow your mind and eye to wander and play with, okay, why do I have shading here? What's happening that I get this cut out? Is that like a squared off violin? So there's actually a kind of mischievousness to Cubism that is hard sometimes to tap into because it is often so intimidating.